Hello and welcome to the next presentation in the series for research methods. Today we're going to look at critical review of published research to actually explore what this is all about and most importantly how to go about doing it. My name is Fred Murphy and I am a lecturer in radiography and medical imaging in the School of Health Sciences, University of Salford. I hope you enjoy the following presentation. During this presentation, we shall have a look at exploring what critical review is all about, the pluses and the minuses. We shall briefly look at the source of the article, where articles generate from and the difference between them in terms of quality and level, etc. And then we shall go about critically dissecting an article. Now, this is a useful skill to have, and we can go through each chapter or each section of an article with some systematic approach as to how we will divide this up and what particular features we shall look for. So we shall do this section by section. After that, we shall give. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is critical review? What would you say critical review represented? And secondly, why is it done? Well, first of all, critical review is an analysis of a paper looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of that publication. It is most important that you don't overlook many of the strengths. Critical review would maybe suggest that you're just looking for the disadvantages or the negative parts of the paper, but it's equally important that you pull out the strengths as well as the weaknesses. In answering the second question, why is it done? There may be a whole host of reasons for this, but most often this is done to give a breakdown of the paper and to look at the paper within its context of research, to actually see what it's all about and to judge its worthiness, to look at its research rigour and how and indeed if this particular paper is applied to your research. So it's a very thorough, systematic review of a research article. Therefore, the aim of a critical review is to identify the strengths, of which there are probably many, and the weaknesses, of which there can be many, of a research publication. To do this effectively, a critical evaluation should be organised around specific sections of a research publication. This systematic approach will ensure that you have a particular pattern to work from when looking at a paper, and will hopefully also ensure that important areas or sections are not overlooked. It's far too easy to have a very quick skim read of a paper and maybe miss some very relevant or salient points. So we will try and develop a systematic approach to that. In order to do this effectively, it's usually easy to look at each chapter or each section of a research publication. You would obviously start with the title in detail. Does that tell you what it's about? The abstract, how detailed is that? Very often you can stop at the abstract if the paper is deemed not to be relevant to your research area. We will then consider the introduction and how important that is. We will look at the literature review and decide what type of papers should be included in a literature review. We will obviously explore the methods and see whether or not the study is reproducible. Could you go away and produce this study purely by reading the evidence within the methodology section? We'll consider results and how they should be displayed, discussion, which tends to be badly done, and finally we shall look at the conclusion of a research publication, and again look at the strengths and look at the weaknesses of each of those areas. Before we do this dissection of an article, I think it's important that we briefly have a look and give some recognition to the importance of the source of the article. Which journal does it come from? Is it a reputable research source? And what are the differences? And how do we know what the level of quality is of the articles? Well, I'm sure you've all come across the terms peer review and non-peer review. Just to clarify these, a peer review paper has been subject to fairly rigorous inspection by a panel of independent reviewers. These are most commonly academics or clinical specialists in the area, and they will review the paper independently and anonymously and give feedback to the journal publishers and to the author as to whether or not they feel the paper is of publishable quality, and or they will suggest changes to the paper and recommend whether or not that paper should be published in the journal at that time. So I think you can have some level of security in knowing that if a paper has been through a peer review process, that there has been some reasonably high level of inspection related to the quality of that particular paper. Non-peer reviews aren't always done in the same way. Usually these aren't subject to such a high level of scrutiny. Sometimes for some journals they're still looked at and read for their suitability and their factual correctness, but they do not go through the same level of rigour and inspection that of peer review papers would do. So again, in summing up non-peer review, you have got to be a little bit more cautious in the overall quality and value of these papers because they have not been subject to such a high level of inspection. Just a little word as well about the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework. Now, if you are a clinical practitioner, you may not have come across this term. This is an inspection or a way of assessing the value of research papers produced by academic institutions, mainly universities. And funding is allocated on the back of the level or the perceived level of the papers produced. So to give you an example, the university would select which particular papers they wanted to put forward for the REF, and these would be looked at by an independent panel and given a score, and the result of that score would carry some funding with it. I just want to put that in there. If, as I say, if you're a clinical practitioner, it may not be relevant to you, but I think it's always useful to know what's out there. And the next Research Excellence Framework meeting is 2012, and then that will occur again in 5 years, I think, in 2017. Next, I want to just mention impact factor. Impact factor is said to be the level of importance of a particular research paper, and different journals have different impact factors. So the higher the impact factor, the more reputable or the higher the quality of the journal is said to be. So academics generally try to aim for a fairly high impact factor. Now, this is not always possible within professional degree programs and within professional bodies. Within my own area of radiography, for example, we have an international peer-reviewed journal called Radiography. But sadly, that doesn't carry an impact factor at this point in time. That leaves us with a little bit of a problem if we are aiming for impact factor, because impact factor is something that is considered by the universities and is also something that's considered by the REF panel to an extent. How do you know what the impact factor of the journal is? It will normally tell you somewhere on the inside cover, and if it doesn't, it will certainly be available on the publisher's website. I would, however, make a point here and say that impact factor isn't always necessarily the most important thing to look for. Obviously, you would look for the relevance of the article and whether or not that fitted with your own research and research areas and the quality, but you would also have to consider the audience as well, the key people that will be reading your article. Again, within my own profession, the impact factor is seen to be insignificant because the radiography journal doesn't carry one. But that doesn't mean to say that the papers are necessarily of a lower quality than that of a low impact factor journal. Indeed, our non-peer reviewed publication, something called Synergy, is more appropriately aimed at clinical practitioners. And I know anecdotally that many of the clinical staff would read the Synergy articles over the peer-reviewed articles in radiography. It's quicker to read, it's more simplistically laid out, and sometimes more relevant to their clinical need. So although these points are important and you need to have an understanding of what they're about, they're not always necessarily going to impact upon your research. Finally, there's a little link there to a YouTube clip which is a tongue-in-cheek approach to research factor and impact factor as well. So do have a look at that when you get a few minutes. So the first thing we come to when we're looking at any article is of course the title. So just turn away from the slides for a moment and think to yourself, perhaps jot it down on a piece of paper, what you think the title should be, what you think the title should include, and how important is the title? Interesting questions. Well, firstly, a title should be relatively concise. A very long-winded title will perhaps confuse the reader and not necessarily get to the point. So a nice concise title usually works quite well. It's quite common as well to leave writing the title to the very end of the study. Because research is dynamic, you may well have changed the focus of your study, and at the end you can often get a better understanding of exactly what the paper is about, and then give a more appropriate title to the study. The title should of course be informative, so that just by reading the title, the reader has an understanding of its relevance. What is it about, and can they use it in their own research or publications? The title should clearly indicate the content. Now that might sound very obvious, but if you look through a series of publications and articles, that's not always the case, and sometimes you might have to go and dig out the article to actually find out whether or not it's suitable for the work that you're conducting. So again, it shows the importance of the quality of the title. And finally, it must indicate the research approach taken. So a qualitative study of the experiences of student nurses would be an example of stating the approach given and also some of the content as well. It would also be deemed to be a concise and fairly informative title. How long should a title be? Well, that depends on the subject area that you're looking at. As a guide, most research books would suggest up to about 15 words would be about a maximum. But of course, it does depend upon the study. But a good title is important. It gives a good header for the study and also for people looking for this type of research in the future. So it should be a true reflection of what the study is all about. So that now takes us to the abstract. Normally the abstract is included within scientific papers and is a very helpful summary of the results and findings from that particular study. How long should an abstract be? Typically somewhere around about 250 to 300 words. Now there is a bit of an art, a bit of a skill to writing an abstract, and trying to condense down the results from your study is an experience and a skill that you will develop over time. It's very often easier to break it down into the subsections, not too unlike the way we are critically analysing our papers in this presentation, and therefore makes it clearer to the reader what the study is all about. Of course, a good, strong abstract will be the difference between downloading or finding the paper or deciding that it's not particularly relevant to your area of study. So, what should the abstract include? Well, it should clearly identify the research problem. Why is it being undertaken? What is the rationale for this study? Is it the clinical relevance? And what is the importance of the overall study? So the research problem needs to be upfront. What are we looking at? The abstract should also contain a hypothesis, or if you're doing a qualitative piece of work, usually aims and objectives. Hypotheses are usually left for quantitative studies, whereas qualitative studies will start with an inductive approach, i.e. a blank piece of paper, and work from there. Typically, you would have an overarching aim, and that would be supported by 3 to 4, possibly 5 objectives, and all of those objectives should work towards achieving the aim you've outlined above. I think aims and objectives are very important within a study, and if you're writing your own research project, you should always keep these at hand and always reflect back on the aims and the objectives of the study so that you're not going too far off track. The abstract should give a flavour for the method that has been used, the research approach, which is most important, and it should also contain some idea of the sample size, again to give the reader a good feel for the size of the study and whether or not it contained a big enough sample to be used effectively. And finally, does the abstract report the major findings? And of course this is essential that it does so that again you can see the whole relevance of the paper and decide whether or not to go ahead and download it. So the abstract is an important section and one that can save you an awful lot of time in seeking out the relevance of research papers. A good quality abstract will give clear direction as to the focus of the study. It is as if you are at a crossroads and you look at the abstract to see which particular direction the study will go in. It is therefore a very important part of any research paper. Arguably, the most important section within a research publication is the introduction. The introduction should grab the reader's attention. It should clearly outline what is being investigated. The most common phrase to use, and one that you can use yourself to start off the writing process, is something like, "The purpose of this study is to." And that gets you off writing. It also sends a signal to the reader about the purpose of the research article up front. The rationale for the study should be clearly stated. Why is this important? And give a very brief overview of the previous work in this area without going into too much detail, because that can be done in a literature review. But briefly, what have other people said about this area of investigation? And why do you think that your study, or the study that you're reading, contributes further to the research within that field? So the introduction is important in grabbing the reader's attention and clearly and unequivocally detailing the problem. We should now consider the literature review that you will look through within the article. A more detailed presentation on how to actually conduct a literature review will be given at a later date. This is just going to consider what you would look for when reviewing an article within the literature review section. Most research texts state that the research should be within the last 5 years. And I think as a guide that is a reasonable time period to consider. However, you must look at the research in context, and if it's a rapidly moving technological change within your area, then perhaps 5 years is too long. Things may have moved on since, and therefore the literature or the currency of the literature may not be up to date. But 5 years, I think, is a suitable guide. A second caveat to that is that seminal texts, many theories, and certainly work within the social sciences may well extend beyond that 5-year gap. This is perfectly acceptable, provided that nothing more recent has been published, and provided that the researcher has acknowledged that fact within his review of the literature. So it is a guide, and as long as you justify your approach, I think you should be fine. As I said, the literature should sufficiently reflect the current state of knowledge within that subject area. Experts will know. The people looking at the work very often are experts within the field, and if there is an important piece of literature missing that would help to form the research approach, it will be obvious. So you need to work carefully through the literature and ensure that you have covered as much of that literature as possible. Obviously, complete saturation is sometimes not possible, but as much as possible you should aim to cover the important literature within that area. In doing so, of course, you will, like in the introduction to critical review, look at the strengths and the weaknesses of previously published literature in the field. Within this, you can also make another approach for your rationale. So you can outline what research has been done and what were the outcomes, and also any gaps in the literature pertaining to your particular study. So in essence, you should clearly identify the need for the proposed research. And one final point on a literature review is just to be careful that you don't inadvertently present any bias into the discussion. It is acceptable to put brief comments within the literature, provided there are not too many, which will help to develop the discussion and the flavour within the literature review. But you do have to be careful that you don't, by doing so, introduce your own personal bias. And of course, referencing within this section is very important. And as ever, you should use the standard university Harvard referencing system to cite all of your publications. Some research texts like to put the aims and objectives before the literature review, whilst others, more traditionally perhaps, will have them at the end of the literature review. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule about this, but I think having considered the literature, the aims and objectives, certainly for a qualitative study, would most suitably follow the literature review after you have considered the work that's previously been published in the field. As mentioned previously, there should be one overarching aim and several objectives that will enable the study to reach that particular aim. It is also common to have these written in a concise manner, usually bullet pointed, so that they are clear to the reader and they can be reflected upon throughout the study. It is also common practice that the aims and objectives are reviewed at the end of the study to ensure that they have been met. The methodology section is essential in the understanding of the entire project. It's necessary to evaluate and also to enable another person to replicate the study at a later date. If by reading the methodology you can reproduce the study in the same level of detail, it is a good indication of a strong and clear methodology. The methodology asks the question how, where and why. The how would ask the question about the research tool that was used to gather the data. It would also consider how long the project was and other influential factors. The where would be the location of the study and perhaps the participants involved. And the why would reflect upon the research approach that had been taken to the study. Other factors, such as the sample size, ethics, and data analysis, are considered later on in this presentation with a purely qualitative perspective applied. When considering your approach to the research, both qualitative and quantitative methods will follow a very simple, similar structure. That is, make an observation or ask a question about a clinical problem, form a hypothesis if it's quantitative, or again construct some strong aims and objectives, conduct the experiment or carry out the research, and either accept the hypothesis or reject the hypothesis, or in a traditional qualitative research, you start with your blank piece of paper and come to some general conclusions. So the information within the methodology must consider sampling method, and you must ensure that this doesn't reflect bias on your behalf. This is particularly important in qualitative research, where very often the research tool can be the researcher themselves. To get around this, reflection and a very honest, open account of your presence within that research project is often required. So you do need to be careful of your role as a researcher and how you will have impacted upon that research. In terms of sample size, if you're doing a traditional quantitative study, you can use sample size calculators, which, given the demographics and the population that you consider, will give you an assessment of a sample size that may be used for your study. And this is also referenced back to the website. So the link there should give you some useful information. And finally, how do you ensure that you've got the correct information from your sample? And this is not easy to answer. You must ensure you have the correct people who are going to give you that answer. It's a little bit like the validity and reliability issues. You have to make sure that what you're measuring is the correct thing, and that if others came into the field, they would get similar results. So experts within the field, and that can be sampled either by a traditional snowballing sample or a convenience sample by going to the people who are the experts in the field and will have that. It is essential that any research publication gives a clear outline of the data collection procedures. How was the data collected, in what particular format, and over what time frame? So this would include dates, perhaps time frames, location if relevant, and the format. Is it digital, is it online, or is it traditional postal questionnaire, for example? It's also important to consider the use of a pilot study at this stage. A pilot study will ensure there is some validity and reliability of the research instruments being used. In this case, the slide refers to questionnaires, but this could equally apply to interviews, and any suggested changes as a result of the pilot should be very clear within the publication. This will then enable the reader to understand why the final data collection tool appears as it does, and why those particular questions are relevant and posed. The data collection section should also give some consideration to the transmission of the data. How was it collected? Was it perhaps verbatim transcriptions following an interview, or was it field notes from observations? And finally, it should acknowledge how the data was secured and even perhaps used for other studies if that was approved
by the Ethics Committee. The issue of ethics is dealt with in another lecture series, but any publication should have some ethical detail within it that would give the reader confidence that this study had been through an ethical panel and everything was all above board. So essentially you would look and see, have ethical issues been considered, and if so, to what degree? Following on from that was informed consent sought from the participants. Was confidentiality assured? And was anonymity also guaranteed? So these are all important questions that should be part of every research publication. The results section of a qualitative piece of work should provide you with the results, the raw data, the important aspects of the raw data selected from the transcripts or perhaps from the questionnaire returns. Results are results. They are not a discussion. There is no requirement to make sense of them in this section. That is left to the discussion section. However, sometimes publications will merge the two together and have a results and discussion chapter, which obviously puts a different spin on what needs to be included. Qualitative quotes, important direct quotations, and other useful information that's linked to the transcriptions in some way helps to place all of this into context, and it's important that the reader can follow this context and see where these quotations have come from. Just one final word on direct quotations. I think they are a very powerful tool within any qualitative article. However, they should be used sparingly for maximum impact and not overused and used excessively within this section. Otherwise they tend to lose their impact and they are not as useful. It also means that the reader then has to convert and reduce down the raw data themselves, making the article generally more difficult to read. The data analysis section should give a very clear indication as to how and why the data was analysed using that particular approach. If this is part of a much larger study, for example a thesis, then the theoretical principles and epistemology may not be present in the shorter version of the publication itself. However, some recognition must be given to this, and the data analysis must be fully justified. So if, for example, a traditional thematic analysis was applied, then the reference to Bernard 1999 or whoever would be included for the reader. I do find that students sometimes struggle to give the project a name and struggle with the actual approach, whether it be grounded theory or phenomenology or whatever. But the most important thing is to make sure that you are analysing your data from one of these traditional perspectives, and not to claim that you are when really there is little understanding or indeed evidence within the paper itself. So a good justification for using that approach is always recommended. As would be the case with any scientific study, it's really important that the rigour and the approach to the journey is very well documented. This gives the reader some confidence that the work has been through some objective measures and is not just a result of the researcher's thoughts. There are several ways in which this can be done, and Couch 2006 talks about the transparent, clear research trail. By this she means that one step clearly leads to the next step and to the next step, so we go from the beginning through the middle procedure and can agree hopefully with the outcomes at the end and the findings of the study. This can be done by using things such as member checks, whereby the interview transcripts would be given back to the participants and they would be asked the question, do these accurately reflect what our interview was all about? Another way of doing this is something called peer validation, whereby the results or the findings are presented to your peers, who may or may not identify with them clearly, and hopefully they would say, yes, this is a true reflection of this phenomena as I find it. And finally, one other method, and of course these can all be used together, is prolonged engagement in the field. And this is particularly important when you're looking at observational studies and using participant observation, so that the researcher becomes part of the natural environment. So this rigor that's applied to the methodology should be transparent and should carry itself through the whole of the study. So to sum up this section, this should give a robust defense of the analysis and give the reader some real confidence in the results. One of the problems with qualitative research is the wording, and many words are used interchangeably, or in fact the scientific model is used, and some of the words from the quantitative paradigms do not necessarily fit, or at least sit comfortably, within qualitative research. Therefore, when discussing rigor, when discussing quality, refer to the qualitative wording and text that accompany qualitative research. I have included a text there for which I do have a slight conflict of interest, being the author, but this paper outlines the principles behind qualitative rigor and gives a good comparison between the terms used within the qualitative domain and those opposing ones within quantitative research. At the end of the paper, it also gives an adaptive model from Gubber and Lincoln, which should also outline clearly the process that the research has taken. This next slide outlines the thought processes that should go through your mind when analysing the data analysis section. Go through quietly now and work out whether or not the article you're considering meets all of these points. The discussion section should pull together the findings from the study. This would probably include reflection on the aims and objectives. Are they met or not? Reflection on the literature reviewed. Do the findings agree or disagree with those previously cited in the literature review? The discussion would also look towards any weaknesses or limitations to the study, and perhaps offer recommendations for future work. Most importantly, however, it should also mention any clinical implications or even potential implications and how these may be reflected on future practice. Care should be taken by the researcher not to overgeneralize the findings. Given the small sample size within traditional qualitative research, the findings are often only related to that particular population, environment, or the phenomena being studied. Having read the discussion, the reader should be quite confident in assessing how valuable the research has been. Does it contribute to the existing body of knowledge? Does it perhaps conflict with the existing body of knowledge? And where does it sit? Again, the researcher should have been careful not to overgeneralize the findings, but to place them into context would be most appropriate. This section is the kind of so what approach. So what has the study found? So what is the significance? So what comes next? So finally, we would reach the conclusion of the research article. Arguably, this is the most important section within the article, since it should provide a very concise summary of the findings and place them in context in terms of their meaning and relevance. The conclusion should not introduce new material, but rather clarify the findings. I do hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
This presentation aimed to give you a structured approach to the critical review of a qualitative published article. Furthermore, it should give you some ideas when planning and structuring your own research proposals in the future. One final thing to mention to you is the CASP tool. The CASP is a critical appraisal skills program tool that gives an objective measure of the quality of the paper. It has several boxes which takes you through each section, not too unlike what we've just done in this lecture, and asks questions about the paper type, the methodology, data analysis, results and discussion, and enables you to compare and contrast them in a fairly objective manner. You can find these online at www.caspinternational.org and click under Qualitative Studies. And they are a very valuable addition to your newly acquired research appraisal skills. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you now have some additional skills and know-how in being able to critically dissect a qualitative research paper. Here are some references for your information, and if you look in Blackboard under Qualitative Research Articles, you will see there we have a list of some interesting articles which you can look at yourself and, applying the skills of critical appraisal, go through and reach your own conclusions as to the quality of the paper. Remember, significantly, critical appraisal is all about both the strengths and the weaknesses of a research paper. Thank you for listening. Good luck with the rest of the module.